Hello, Biology 101 Intro to Anatomy and Physiology class. Today we're going to begin talking about Chapter 7, which is about the muscular system. So in the last chapter we talked about the skeletal system and some of their functions. One of those functions was to work with the muscular system in order to be able to move and interact with our environment. And so now we're going to move to this next system and learn about how these muscles attach to bones, learn about their anatomy and about their physiology. So let's get started. So when we talk about the muscular system itself, we are mainly talking about skeletal muscles, and I'll tell you a little bit more about those in just a second. And that's what we're going to focus most of this chapter on. But to begin the chapter, we're going to talk about all the different muscle types in the body. Okay, so there are actually three types of muscles, three categories of muscles that we have in our body, and these are the three listed here. The first one is skeletal muscle, we have cardiac muscle, and we have smooth muscle. Now once again, when we're talking about the muscular system, we're focusing on skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle is found just in the heart, and so we'll talk more about cardiac muscle when we talk about the cardiovascular system. And then smooth muscle is found in vessels and in organs. So smooth muscle, we'll talk about smooth muscle when we talk about the cardiovascular system, which is the veins and the arteries. We'll mention it when we talk about the digestive system, because the organs, our digestive organs have smooth muscle. And we already did talk about smooth muscle a little bit when we talked about the integumentary system. So if you guys remember the erector pili muscles, those little tiny muscles that attach to each of the hairs in our body, those are smooth muscles, and so we already saw a little bit of smooth muscle. And then skeletal muscle we call it skeletal muscle because these are the muscles that attach to our bones, and these are the muscles that allow us to move. And these are our voluntary muscles. These are the ones that we can consciously control. We can think about moving skeletal muscles. So we're going to compare and contrast these three different types of muscles, and I want to write some things down here. So the first thing that I already mentioned about skeletal muscles is we consider these voluntary muscles, so we can decide when we want to move them and when we don't want to move them. Cardiac muscles, on the other hand, are involuntary, meaning that our body obviously controls them, but we don't consciously think, oh, I need to pump my heart. It's pumping, and that can be increased and decreased based on physiological signals, but we can't think about increasing our heart rate or not. And the same thing with smooth muscles. They are involuntary, so we don't control our digestive muscles and all those things. Luckily, I mean, it'd take a lot of effort if we have to think about all these things. So smooth muscles and cardiac muscles, they are involuntary. Skeletal muscles are voluntary, and that's one thing that sets skeletal muscle apart from these other two. The next thing is skeletal muscle is striated. And what I mean by that, I'm going to go to the next slide to show you this. Striated means that when you look at it under a microscope, you see this banding pattern in the muscle fibers. So this first picture here on the left is skeletal muscle, and you can see these lines running throughout. And we're going to talk more about what those are a little bit later. Those bands, though, are created by proteins in the muscles, actin and myosin. So anyway, so you see the striped appearance, we call that striations. Now if you look at cardiac muscle, it's a little bit harder to see, but cardiac muscle is also striated, meaning that it has the same actin and myosin type of makeup, the proteins that make it up. But smooth muscle, on the hand, is not striated. So you can see there are some things that some of these muscles have in common and some that are different. So skeletal muscle is striated, cardiac muscle is striated, that makes them similar. Smooth muscle is not striated, so it's different in that way. The next one, skeletal muscle has multiple nuclei per muscle cell, or in this case we call these muscle fibers. So muscle cells are considered muscle fibers. So let's go back to this picture here. Oops, a little bit too far. Okay, so this is our muscle cell here, our skeletal muscle cell. These little dark spots on the edges of the muscle, those are nuclei, or singular is nucleus, plural is nuclei. So you can see that this is a single muscle fiber or muscle cell. You can see here, we can see at least 3 nuclei per each cell. Skeletal muscle, a little bit harder to see a single cell here, but here's, for example, a cell, and there's a nucleus there. Here's a different cell, and here's a nucleus there. So there's a single nucleus per cell, and the same thing with the smooth muscle. Here's a nucleus, the cells around that, here's the nucleus. You can see that there's just a single nucleus per cell. The other thing that sets these apart is the shape. So skeletal muscle is long and thin, very long, thin cells. Cardiac muscle has shorter cells, but they have branched cells. And let's see, a good example up here. You can kind of see this little branching going on here. So the cardiac muscles are individual cells, but they're branched so that they connect to the other cells around them. And then smooth muscle is they're small spindle shape, meaning that they taper at both ends. Kind of starts pointy, gets a little fatter, and then ends up pointy. So they're spindle-shaped cells. They're a little bit different than these other cells. Okay, along with the fact that skeletal muscles are long and thin, each muscle fiber in skeletal muscle goes from one side of a muscle to another. So in other words, if we're looking at, let's look at this little picture up above here. We're looking at a muscle here. So these cells are running. Let's look at this long one here. So a single skeletal muscle cell is going to run the length of a muscle. That's pretty amazing. So depending on how long your muscle is, that's going to tell you how long the cell is in that muscle. And see, I was gonna say that. So they're microscopic. So they're very, very thin. So each muscle cell is microscopic, but it's very, very long. But by binding them together, putting a whole bunch of them together, then we can obviously see the muscle, but we can't see the individual muscle cells. A little bit more about cardiac muscle. This branching, they also have what are called intercalated discs. And you can see this little darker line here in the picture. That's an intercalated disc. You can see it written here. And what that means, this is a junction between two cells, but it's full of all these pores, which means that the cells between the intercalated discs can communicate with each other. When you think about this, is really important in the function of the cardiac muscle. So we want the heart cells to all pump in unison, and so they've got to be able to communicate with each other so that they're all working together. And that's what these intercalated discs, even though they're separate cells, because there are pores between the cells, they function almost as a single cell, and so they're able to carry out their function. Okay, so you can see the similarities and differences between these types of cells. So just to review, skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle are both striated, and smooth muscle is not striated. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. Cardiac and smooth muscle are involuntary. Skeletal muscle is attached to the skeleton, to the bones, and they're long, thin cells that are multinucleated. The cardiac muscle is only found in the heart, a single nucleus per cell, and these cells are branched and have intercalated discs. And then smooth muscle is spindle-shaped cells found in the walls of hollow organs and in vessels, and they have a single nucleus per cell. So those are the 3 different types of muscles and how they relate and compare to each other. So you'll want to know this comparison. You want to know how they all compare to each other. Okay, but as I said, we're just now going to focus on skeletal muscle, basically for the rest of this chapter. And as I mentioned, we'll see cardiac muscle and smooth muscle will pop up again as we go through some of the other systems in the body. But in the muscular system, we're just going to focus on skeletal muscle. So as I said just a second ago, these muscle cells are long and very, very thin, but they are packed together. And the way they're packed together is by connective tissues surrounding them. So we have the endomysium, the paramysium, and the epimysium. And these beginning parts here, we're going to see these sorry, we're going to see these throughout the semester. Endo, para, and epa. We've seen epa and endo already. Para is kind of a new one. And then mesium is referring to muscles. So endo means on the inside, para is basically intermediate, and epa is on the outside. So we have connective tissue. If it's endomesium, that means it's on the inside of the muscle. Paramecium means it's around kind of a central part of the muscle. And then epimecium means it's on the outside of the muscle. So let's look at where these are found. So here's a muscle, here's our bone, our humerus. Here's the muscle that's attached by tendons to this bone, and we basically sliced this. This is a transverse section here, so we're looking straight at the muscle, and you can see all these little bundles in here. Okay, each of these little pieces here is representing a muscle fiber or a muscle cell. So what we can see, we see all these little dots in here, these little red dots with some white stuff around it, and then a bunch of dots are connected together into these groups, and then we have the whole muscle itself. Alright, so each of these little dots again is a single muscle fiber or muscle cell. You can see that here. Around each individual muscle cell, that's where we find the endomesium. Endo, again, inside the muscle. So endomesium is a connective tissue covering around each individual muscle fiber in the body. Now these muscle fibers are bundled together in groups, and we call these groups fascicles. A group of muscle fibers bound together is called a fascicle. And guess what? It has a connective, of each fascicle has a connective tissue covering around it, and that's called the paramecium. So it's around groups of muscle fibers. And then finally, all of these fascicles come together to form the whole muscle. So groups of fascicles come together to form the whole muscle, and that also has a connective tissue covering around it, and we call that the epimecium. So endomecium is around each individual muscle fiber. The paramecium is around bundles of muscle fibers called fascicles, and then the epimecium is around the whole muscle, and it becomes continuous with the tendons that attach this muscle to the bones. Here's another view here that you can see. You can see the bone here in the middle. You can see the fascicles, the bundles of muscle fibers, and then you can see the individual muscle itself. So here's a muscle here. Here are the bundles of fascicles, and each of those fascicles is made up of little tiny individual cells. But notice that the muscle fiber itself runs from one end of this muscle, and it'll go all the way to the other end of the muscle. Okay, so endomecium, paramecium, epimecium. Next, let's talk about the functions of the skeletal muscle. So the first function I know that you would just know automatically, maybe the first two. The muscles in our body, the skeletal muscles in our body, they support our body and allow us to move our bones and basically move our body around. So those are the two main things that we think of when we think of the skeletal muscle system. And those are probably their premier functions there is movement. However, the muscles also have a couple other functions we don't necessarily think about. Muscles help us maintain our body temperature. And we talked a little bit about this again when we talked about the integumentary system. Just want to remind you here though, that the movement of our muscles is the main thing that creates heat in our body, and that's what helps maintain our body temperature. When we're working out, it becomes excess heat because we heat up too much, and then we have to cool our body down. If we get too cold, then our body, remember, will start shivering. Our body will involuntarily start moving the skeletal muscles to try to produce some heat, to try to bring our temperature back up. Another thing that muscle cells do is that they help, as they contract, they help move fluids around our system, particularly the veins and then the vessels of the lymphatic system. Lymphatic system you may not have heard about before. We'll talk more about that in a later section. But the vessels of the veins, the cardiovascular system, the veins and the lymphatic vessels, they don't have a lot of muscle themselves to contract and move fluids along, but they're situated within the skeletal muscles, or going through our skeletal muscles. And so as our skeletal muscles contract, it'll help squeeze these vessels and move that fluid along. And then finally, there is some protection that's given by our skeletal muscles. Think particularly about the organs of our abdominal area. So we have our thoracic area, our lungs and our heart. We have the ribs that are helping to protect those, but our abdomen, we really don't have much there. I mean, we don't have any bones there besides the vertebrae and back. So anyway, so our muscles in our abdomen are there to help also protect our internal organs. So, all right, so those are the functions of the skeletal system. We've talked about the makeup and the difference between the three types of muscles: skeletal, cardiac, and smooth. And so we're going to leave this video here, and we'll pick up with some of the microscopic anatomy in the next video.